Tanrı'nın varlığına dair olası nedenler argümanı nedir?
The argument from possible causes is, I think of it as kind of an argument strategy for helping us to investigate the nature of our world. And I use this kind of argument to see if I can uncover something about the nature of our world that points to a theistic foundation, or a foundation in terms of divine qualities like power, knowledge, goodness. And so what I like to do is divide this argument into two stages. Um, you can think of this as an argument that makes use of a principle that is more modest, or it requires less than other kinds of arguments from cause and effect, because this is an argument from merely possible causes. And so some people are skeptical that maybe every event actually has a cause, but would every event at least have a possible cause? Some people who are skeptical that there's actually a cause might allow for the possibility of a cause, and that will open up another pathway. So to set up the argument, I want to just begin with a classic principle of explanation. I'm going to call this PE, principle of explanation. And this principle says that you can expect an explanation as far as you can. And what I mean by this is, if let's say you see some rocks and they're organized into a certain pattern, maybe the pattern of rocks is a display of your name in your language. You might wonder, why are there those rocks? Why are they organized that way? And maybe there's some kind of explanation in terms of somebody put those rocks into those positions to give you a message. Or maybe the wind just sort of blew the rocks into those positions. Either way, there's some kind of explanation in terms of prior states of reality that help to illuminate why there is this effect. And my thought here is that, in general, if you can have an explanation, it's preferable to think that there really is some explanation, okay? But the argument I'm going to give you is going to be using a more modest principle from possible explanation. So I'm going to call this the principle of possible explanation, or PPE. And this says that you can expect a possible explanation as far as you can. To be more precise about this, we could say it this way. For anything that exists, you have some reason to expect that that thing has some possible explanation. Maybe some possibility that there was wind that blew it into that formation, some possible cause of it, unless you have some reason to think that it cannot have any possible explanation. So the idea here is the default stance will be to expect a possible explanation. And two kinds of motivation for this principle. One would be just from experience. It seems like this principle, possible explanation, accounts for a lot of experiences. We experience things having an explanation, so at least they would possibly have an explanation. And then you almost might think that just reason itself sort of invites you to think that if something exists, the very fact that it exists sort of calls out for at least the possibility of an explanation. Now, maybe there's an exception. Maybe there's some reason you have that a certain kind of thing couldn't possibly have an explanation, and then that's okay. So this principle just invites you to explain things as far as you can. So now I'm going to use this principle. This is kind of like this tool that I'm going to use, PPE, the principle of possible explanation, to now think about the nature of reality. And I'm putting my argument into two parts, or two stages. The first part seeks to identify a kind of foundational layer or aspect of reality. And then the second part seeks to uncover the nature of that foundational aspect. So focusing now on the first stage, I'm going to present what I'm going to call an argument from possible causes. And here's an outline of the argument. It goes like this. Premise one, there is a possible explanation of why there are contingent things. Now, a contingent thing is just something that exists, but its existence is not a matter of necessity. It could possibly fail to exist. So you might think of like a rock like this. A rock could be destroyed. The existence of a rock is not a matter of necessity. And the idea here is that if there are contingent things, then by this principle of possible explanations, PPE, you can expect a possible explanation of the very fact that there are any contingent things at all. Okay, so why are there rocks? Why are there planets? Why are there particles? Take any of them. Why are there any at all? Why not just no contingent things, for example? And by the way, I want to just clarify that this notion of explanation, I'm thinking of it as something that can help reduce mystery, but it doesn't have to completely resolve all mysteries. So for the sake of modesty and neutrality, I'm going to allow that an explanation doesn't have to be a necessitating or deterministic explanation. Maybe it merely raises the probability. Maybe if the wind blows, that increases the probability that sand take a certain formation. And so the wind blowing can then provide some, at least partial explanation of the sand taking that formation. And then finally, I'm thinking of explanations as not being circular. So if a chicken produces itself, that would be like a circular cause. I'm thinking that explanations really illuminate the thing they're explaining if they're not entirely included or dependent on the thing they're explaining. So I just want to make those clarifications. And then with those clarifications, we can continue this argument because we can say, hey, according to this principle of expecting an explanation as far as we can, it looks like we can at least expect an explanation of why there are contingent causes. Again, unless there's some special reason to think that there could not possibly be an explanation of contingent causes. And I want to kind of, in a way, leave that as an open inquiry for people to think about. Maybe you have some reason to think that an explanation of contingent causes would be impossible. And then you can sort of explore that reason. But my thought here is that the default assumption is to explain things as far as you can, and that gives some reason to expect an explanation of contingent causes. Then to avoid circularity, the second premise is that if there is a possible explanation of why there are contingent causes, then there is going to be some kind of non-contingent condition or explanation of those contingent causes. And again, that's to avoid that circularity. The explanation of the contingent causes won't be purely in terms of contingent causes, because my thought is that would be a kind of circular explanation. And we're trying to understand, why are there any contingent causes at all? The thought here is that there's going to have to be an appeal to something that's not itself a contingent cause, at least on the notion of explanation as I'm thinking of it here. Now, all of this is going to lead us to the conclusion that it's at least possible for there to be a necessary foundation, but this is where the argument from possible causes can make use of some developments in the logic of possibility, specifically that in the logic of possibility, there's a reason to think that if something has necessary existence, then it would have necessary existence in all possible worlds. And what that means is that if there's even a possible necessary reality, then that's enough to show that there is actually a necessary reality, as long as our possible world is possible with respect to the possible world in which there is a necessary reality. Okay, if this makes sense, the idea is that either a necessary thing is impossible or it's necessary. And so if we can show that there's a possible explanation in terms of a necessary thing, that will be enough to show that there is actually a necessary thing that's capable of being a foundation for contingent causes. Okay, now we just covered a lot here, but this is the skeleton of this argument for a necessary foundation of contingent causes using a principle of expecting a possible explanation as far as we can. And if this argument is sound, then this will complete the first stage of the argument, because this will uncover there's some kind of foundation of contingent things. Then we move on to the second stage. And in the second stage, we want to see if we can understand what would be the nature of this foundational reality, if there is this foundational reality. And I want to just kind of point out that like anybody from any perspective can come together and have this question about fundamental reality. I mean, it is kind of an open question for people, like, is it energy? Is it particles? Is it God? Like, what is the nature of the foundational reality? Well, the first stage of the argument gives us at least one attribute, that the fundamental reality isn't a merely contingent thing that could be created or destroyed. It has a more robust kind of existence. This is what allows it to explain contingent things. Now, let me just say that as I've been thinking about how we might identify the foundational reality, I've thought of two different tools that I think are very useful for thinking about what this foundational reality might be like. And both tools are going to, in a certain way, make use of this principle of explanation again. So the principle of explanation, it serves the first stage as well as the second stage. But let me just give you these two tools. So the first tool is a clearing away tool. This tool clears away aspects of our description of fundamental reality that one could further explain. So for example, colors, shapes, trees, rocks. So I mean, to be very honest with you guys, I really don't think fundamental reality is composed most fundamentally of rocks. And here's why. It's because of that principle of explanation, that there can be a further explanation of rocks. And I have no independent reason to think that explaining rocks has to stop. So same for grass, same for glass, same for the flying spaghetti monsters. Okay, all of these things call for further explanation. And I think all these things can at least possibly have a further explanation. And so this foundational reality, which admits of no possible further explanation, wouldn't be fundamentally colorful or a shape or a tree or a rock. So this is a clearing away tool. You can use this tool by just asking yourself, which things could be further explained. And then the second tool is a filling in tool. So this is a tool where you fill into your description of fundamental reality some characteristic that doesn't admit of a further explanation. You have an independent reason in your own mind to think, what, that can't really be further explained, not in the sense of an external prior condition. And let me just give you a few examples of some attributes that might fill in the nature of fundamental reality. Well, we already saw having necessary existence. So you might think that the total of the necessary reality can't itself depend on anything prior, because the necessary reality is the foundation of all the other realities, all the contingent realities. So you might think that necessity in total is bedrock of the rest of reality. Same for being independent, being real. I mean, this is an attribute that it's hard to see how you could explain why this fundamental reality is real in terms of something prior, because that prior thing would itself already be real. And so the existence of reality is already there, if that makes sense. So that'd be circular. Also being foundational. Now, you might be wondering, well, what else can we fill in to the nature of this foundation? And this leads me to my final argument, which is what I'm going to call an argument from possible natures. And this is also going to use that principle of possible explanation. So the next premise goes like this. Only a purely perfect nature, by which I'm going to define this as a nature that entails some perfection or quality of value or greatness without any arbitrary limits. So an example of this might be, it entails a great power to produce, let's say, intelligent beings. Perhaps it also has its own intelligence, because that would contribute to its value and its greatness. And this premise is saying that only a purely perfect nature could fail to possibly have a further explanation. The idea is that anything less than that purely perfect nature could at least conceivably be explained in terms of prior causes that explain the particular limits and boundaries in the nature. It might explain particular powers it has or particular arrangement of its parts. Only a purely perfect nature, it seems to me, would provide that stopping ground, the terminus for explanation, or at least it's a good candidate for filling in the nature of fundamental reality. So then the next premise is that the fundamental nature of fundamental reality cannot have a further explanation because it's fundamental. And then from here, we get the conclusion that fundamental reality is fundamentally purely perfect. And again, what this means is that it doesn't have arbitrary boundaries or limitations built into its nature, but instead it has some positive quality, like power, power to know, power to produce. And this positive quality is filled out completely so that there's no need for further explanation to explain why does it have that boundary or that part there. It's just completely unrestricted in its nature. So this is an outline of the two-stage argument from possible causes. I think it does invite inquiry from all sides and all perspectives. I don't claim to have sort of the last word on the argument. In fact, I want to invite people to really think about the steps of the argument by their own lights and consider that tool for clearing away attributes from fundamental reality that would, by your own light, call for further explanation, or the filling in some attribute that, by your own light, would seem to not be able to have further explanation. And I think those two tools will help you to fill out your own theory of reality. So thank you for your time. I hope this was helpful for you.